Hi everybody, welcome to the very first webcast for RDA Moreton Bay. We're here today in partnership with SRJ Walker Wayland and the fabulous Di Brown presenting the workshop today, Getting Grant Ready. I'm going to be staffing the Facebook page and taking your comments. So comments and questions, I guess is what I really mean. As always, we have to do some housekeeping. I don't have to tell you where the toilets are, but I do have to tell you this is our first live stream. It's also the first time we've done it in this venue. So if we drop out, hang in for a few minutes. Please be assured that if it was to drop out permanently, and we hope it doesn't, we will be uploading it to our website, to SRJ's website, and to another partner, Innovate Moreton Bay's website, and I think Business Moreton Bay Region as well. So you'll be able to get it later today. We also want you to know that if you aren't able to get all your questions to us today, we'll take them on email and follow them up in the next few days. So we'll show you that email address at the end of the session, which is going to run for approximately 90 minutes, right, Di? Yeah.
Between 90 minutes and 2 hours.
Okay. So we're really looking forward to this. I hope you enjoy it too, and I hope you get something really good out of it.
Thank you, Nettie. Well, welcome. This is an exciting event, it's a first for a lot of us. So I'd like to make it, even though that you're all attending remotely today, I'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So as Nettie said earlier, please ensure that you send through any questions via the Facebook site or comments. I'll repeat the questions so that the rest of the group can hear that, and then we'll continue working through the rest of the workshop. My name is Di Brown. I am a Chartered Accountant and Business Advisor with SRJ Walker Wayland. I have over 25 years experience working in the accounting industry and working with businesses across a wide range of different industries. So retail, service industries, manufacturing, not-for-profits, quite a lot of different industries across 2 states and 2 different countries. My passion has always been, though, education. So over the last few years, I've transitioned away from what you might associate as the typical accounting work in terms of tax returns and audits and financial statements to focus where my passion lies, which is business advisory and education. And educating business owners and managers like yourselves on the importance of planning for your business success, the importance of understanding how to read and interpret your financial statements and use those financial statements to make informed business decisions. I work with a lot of my clients in a number of different ways. One of the things that we do and that's quite relevant at the moment is in terms of planning for business continuity and business success. I think we can all agree that it's a very unusual and pretty scary and off-putting time that we're facing at the moment. So it's even more crucial at the moment that we start planning for that business success. And that's how I fell into grant funding. So quite a few years ago, I would go through strategic planning processes with clients, and we would identify what their business vision was, what their goals were, and break it down into detailed strategies supported by detailed action items to help them achieve those goals. But as anybody knows that's in the SME market, we don't all have a pot of cash available to actually go and then fund those projects. So I started to work with clients to look at, well, what alternate funding streams are actually available? And I came across government grants. So I've been working in the grant space for 7 or 8 years now, and I always say to people who contact me is the most important thing that you can do to get yourself ready for a grant is to have your business planned and mapped out and ready for that grant success. So today I'm going to take you through how you can actually do that. So at SRJ Walker Wayland, we have a number of different offices. We are based in Brendale, we have an office at the Sunshine Coast, and we also have a satellite office in the Sydney. So we like to think of ourselves as more than just accountants. We are all about growing businesses and growing the people within those businesses. So I work a lot around strategic planning, profit improvement, business improvement, managing growth, financial literacy, evaluating alternate funding sources, online and face-to-face coaching with clients to help keep you on track and on task to achieve your goals, And then also we have our traditional tax returns, financial statements and audit activities. So that's a little bit about us. In terms of today, what I'd like to take you through today is to talk about what grant funding is and what it actually isn't. I'd also like to talk to you and give you some examples about the type of things that I've used it to fund different projects for with various clients. We'll talk about the 7 steps that I always work through with clients in terms of getting that business grant ready. We'll talk about how to read some detailed grant guidelines. And having said that, you would have each received an email from RDA this morning that had a number of different attachments to it. So everybody should have a copy of the PowerPoints from today. You will also have received some supporting information, a worksheet that I'll be giving you time to complete and ask questions about as we go through today. And also a set of grant guidelines for one particular grant. Now, we're not going to actually complete this grant application. It's about teaching you how to get grant ready and how to actually start mapping that grant to these detailed grant guidelines. Finally, we'll talk about what happens when you get a grant and everybody forgets about the acquittal requirements that go along with receiving government grants. And also we'll talk about what grants might be available to you. And in light of the recent federal and state government announcements, I'll also be touching on the coronavirus stimulus packages that have been recently made available to businesses. So that's what I would like to cover. Now I'd like to have some input from those of you who are watching from home. So if I could ask you just to put a couple of comments on the Facebook site about if there is anything specific that you would like to address in today's workshop or what you hope to achieve from sitting and participating in this session. So Nettie will, if you just put your comments on the page, Nettie will read them out and I'll write them up on the board here.
We've got 12 people online at the moment.
Okay, great. So I think there's currently 12 of you live. Does anybody have any burning thing that they would like to address in today's workshop?
Nothing coming through so far.
No? Okay, please feel free to list those comments or questions as we go throughout today. Okay, so let's talk about grant funding. So what is it, what isn't it, and what will it fund? So grant funding is not a free handout from the levels of government. You actually need to work to get that government money. It's public funds, and therefore there are steps, processes and reporting requirements associated with you being allocated different grant funds. Yep.
I've got a couple of comments through.
Yep.
Tamara Smith says we're an association and not-for-profit, so I guess her area of interest is going to be how this relates to not-for-profits. I've got Kerry saying grants for sole providers or the ease of partnering with another body to access.
Hang on, I can't write that fast.
That's auspicing, isn't it? Yeah.
Could you say that again?
Grants for sole providers or the ease of partnering with another body to access an application. So auspicing, I guess, when they're not incorporated.
Yep.
Level of record keeping that relates to the acquittal requirements. That's from Gordon. And Linda says, hope to access grants to run workshops for BPW Caboolture.
Okay. Let's talk about those couple of things that we've raised. Not-for-profits. I work with a lot of not-for-profits, and one of the things that I would really like to say to not-for-profits is that every not-for-profit organisation should be running as if you on the same principles as any other business. So that means planning for your business success. That means planning to get grant ready. So yes, there are a lot of grants in the not-for-profit space, but the principles that you use to get yourself ready to apply for those grants and the principles about mapping to guidelines, which I'll be talking about today, are exactly the same as for any for-profit business. I will also be touching on specific grants at the end for both businesses and also not-for-profit entities. In terms of sole providers, Kerry, there are grants available for sole practitioners or sole traders, and we'll talk about some of those this afternoon. In terms of partnering with organisations, some grants actually require a lead applicant. But as you'll see as we go throughout today, grants are very different beasts, and there are literally thousands of them across 3 different tiers of government and across industries and also general business grants. So I don't have time to go into everybody's individual situation and what they're looking to apply for, but I am going to be sharing with you some of the more general and more widely used grants today. Record keeping, Gordon, we will talk about record keeping as part of the acquittal requirements when we get to that today, and also what grants are available to perhaps run workshops. We might have to park that one at the moment because off the top of my head I can't think of any specific education grant that actually would be applicable for that. However, there are certainly business grants that would be accessible to BPW to help the business or the organisation or association itself. So as we go through, if you've got any more queries, please just continue to feed them through. So what I would like to talk about in terms of the type of things it funds, as I've said, there are thousands of grants and they all will fund different things. So I have access grants for both not-for-profits and for-profit type entities to fund things such as strategic planning, cash flow forecasts, business structure advice, 3-way budgeting, digital marketing plans and strategies, websites, hosting fees, systems and process documentation, performance appraisal development programs, coaching for different clients, skills development, training needs analysis. The list is endless. So there's services, and then there's also what we call nuts and bolts, and different grants will fund different things. So in the nuts and bolts, or what we consider to be asset type grants, I've had a lot of success in that space under a few different programs, including recently accessing $900,000 under the Made in Queensland program for a client to implement some leading edge manufacturing equipment and make their factory a smart factory by integrating that relevant technology. So there are a lot that is actually available. You just need to know where to look and how to get ready to apply for them. So let's think about growth. So hopefully anybody that even works in a business is aware that growth does not necessarily equate to profit, and profitability certainly doesn't mean that you have cash in the bank. And in fact, in my experience, a lot of businesses go under not because they're not profitable businesses, but because they can't manage their cash flow, particularly in uncertain times like we're in at the moment. So it's important that that budgeting process is critical to your business success. We also know that any growth or retention period is a high risk period. So planning for how you're going to get through the next 6 months is going to be critical. And planning your funding and what grants might be available to assist you will fit perfectly within that. So can grants help you achieve weathering the next 6 months or 6 to 12 months? Who knows how long the economic impact is going to be felt for? The short answer is yes, but. And I say but because preparation is key. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to be going through the detail of the 7-step processes that I always work with clients through in terms of ensuring your business or not-for-profit organisation is best placed for grant success. I want you to understand the importance of having that strategic business plan and why that business plan becomes the blueprint for your business success, but also the foundation stone on which all of your grant applications are based. We'll talk about practical tips and things to watch out for when you are completing a grant application, and I'll also talk to you about the importance of how to read different types of grant guidelines and how to map your application to that particular set of guidelines. Finally, we'll go through an overview of the different funding arrangements that are out there, including the recently released coronavirus stimulus package. Okay, 7 steps to getting grant ready. First step, consider your readiness. Second step, identify your project. Third step, understand the detail and how to map to the guidelines. Prepare, plan, maximise your funding potential by leveraging different programs. Understand how the financial co-contributions will work and understand the importance of involving advisors throughout the process. So I'm going to go through each of these steps in more detail. So step 1 is plan, and I cannot stress this often enough. I have so many people ring me when they hear about a grant and say, I really want to apply for this grant. And I say, why? And they say, because I can't afford, I want to do this project because I think it's a good idea and I can't afford it without a grant. It's a completely the wrong approach. Firstly, you should never do a grant just for the sake of doing a grant application because the detail and requirements are far too onerous. You apply for a grant because it is in the best interest of your business to obtain that grant, and if you are successful or not, you would still most likely go ahead with that project. And the reason I say that is because grants are competitive beasts. So you might have the best application possible, but you don't know who you are competing against. So even though your application is brilliant, there might be somebody out there that has just a better idea than you, or has a business opportunity that's going to generate more jobs, more growth, and therefore pick you at the post, because there's only certain pots of dollars allocated to different grant programs. Unfortunately, not everybody gets a grant. Okay, so how do you get yourself ready? Grants timelines are really, really tight. The most grants are open for tend to be about 28 days. So I always say to clients, particularly for larger grant programs, could you seriously get all of that documentation and invoices and proposals and market value propositions and all sorts of things organised and submitted within a 28-day period? And usually most people can't, or they do an inadequate job and they've wasted all of that time actually applying. So how do you get ready? You plan for it. So strategic business planning is all about looking at where your business is now, where you want it to be, and being really specific about what your where and your vision actually looks like. What products do you sell? What services do you sell? What's your product mix? Where's your profitable products? Where are your clients? Who are your clients? What staff skill sets do you need? What technology and systems and platforms do you need in place to be able to achieve those? And once you've mapped that all out, then you come to the how. Okay, so we know what we look like now. We know where we want to be. How are we actually going to get there? And this is where you break it down into different action items. And those different action items, that is what you look to use for grant funding to help you achieve it. So by doing a strategic business plan up front, it does two things. Firstly, it becomes the blueprint for your business success. So does anybody here have a business plan? Can I just get you to say yes or no on your Facebook feeds if you have a business plan? And if your answer is yes, have you revisited that business plan in the last 6 months? Or even better, in the last month? So do we have any yeses for people that regularly visit their business plan? No, and that is quite common. So what you might find is that when you started your business, you might have looked at a website and thought, oh, I need a business plan. Yep, so we've got a few.
Molly Brum, do you know Molly? Because she says hi, Karen. Molly says she has a very basic one. Tamara says that hers is being updated. Kerry says components of one, I guess. And Tamara then says it has changed. So theirs is being updated, but it's obviously in a state of flux.
Great. Yeah. So it's good to see that a lot of you actually have started the process. I don't want you to get hung up on making that business plan a 20-page template document that gets completed because you read somewhere that if you start a business, you got to tick off you've got a business plan, and you put it in the bottom drawer and you never visit it again. So the strategic plans I like to do are what we call one-page documents. So they might actually go for 3 or 4, but they're very simple, easy to read. You put it up on your wall near your workspace, you put it up in your lunchroom where everybody can see it, so everybody knows you're on the same page, and you map out the actions, you put allocated responsibilities, and you put timelines around them. So that plan becomes the pathway to your business achieving that business goals. So that's the first reason you want to do it. And if you haven't got a plan, how do you know where you're going, let alone how you're going to get there? Secondly, by having a business plan and having action items that include a project that you're actually looking to apply for grant funding for, it shows the funding body, which is usually a level of government, that you are prepared, that you are capable, and that you have planned to make this program or project that you're looking for funding for to be a success. So my practical tip number 1 to you is your strategic plan becomes the blueprint and the foundation on which all grant applications should be based. And all good grant applications will be referencing that business plan and strategic plan throughout each application. So step 2 is, so you've got your plan. You've identified what projects you may want to access funding for. Step 2 is, then you've got to work out, well, how can I map that to a program? And what's an appropriate project for different grant programs? And grants have, yes, we've got a question.
Yes, Kerry's asking, do you have a good template for the one-pager? Is that in their handouts?
It's not in your handouts, Kerry, but I will email it to you.
There you go.
So I will email everybody on today just a one-page template to get you started on your business plans. And it's very, very basic. And that's all you need as long as you have allocated responsibilities, timelines, and that you actually implement it. Okay, so in terms of grants, most grants have 2 types of eligibility requirements. So the first eligibility requirement is about the business itself. So it's about looking at what the business structure is, what the turnover levels are, what industry you might be in, what your employee numbers are, so that each grant will list eligibility requirements at a business level. Your first point in applying for any grants is to tick that you meet every single one of those eligibility requirements. The second step is it talks about what is an eligible project. And you need to be making sure that what you are actually looking to do fits within the grant funding guidelines, because each grant will have eligible and ineligible funding requirements. So what I would like us now to do is, if you could online open up the document that is the guidelines for the small business digital grant, and it looks like that. So it is a green document, green header at the top, and it goes for about, this one's only about 9 pages. So firstly, if I could just ask, do we think this grant is relevant to not-for-profits? Because I think we have quite a few not-for-profits on the other end. So simple yes or no. Do you think a not-for-profit can apply for a small business digital grant? The second question that I want us to think about is, do you have to be GST registered to apply for this particular grant? And the third question is there a turnover limit? Okay, the first thing we need to know is, where do we look in your detailed guidelines to actually find the solutions to that? What I would like you to do is flip to page 2 or scroll down to page 2 of the Word documents. Yep, well done, Kerry, you're correct. So Kerry said yes. Is it eligible for is a not-for-profit eligible? Is there turnover limits? Do you have to be registered for GST? The answer to all of those 3 questions are yes.
Would it allow for a CRM system is a question from Tamara.
Tamara, the answer is yes, but we're jumping ahead because we're just now we're looking at projects that it might fund.
Kerry says GST, not necessarily. So we're getting...
Okay. let's go to the eligibility criteria. Let's have a look at page 2 of the detailed guidelines. So page 2 lists in this particular grant the criteria for eligibility for the business itself. So this is before we even get to projects and CRMs and things. So in terms of this particular criteria, you just have to be a business with less than 20 employees, that you have an active ABN and be registered for GST, that you're based in Queensland with a turnover of less than $2 million, and that a director or owner of that business has not previously been declared or is not currently an undischarged bankrupt. So if you fit all of those criteria, regardless of whether you are a sole trader or whether you are a not-for-profit entity, you are entitled to apply for this grant under the business criteria. Where a lot of sole traders, just to go back to Kerry's question earlier, so if you're a sole trader, what I have found previously is that some grants will exclude you if you are below the GST threshold and therefore not registered. So in order to access this grant, this is one of those grants. So you must actually be GST registered with an active ABN to be able to access this grant. So that's the first step. The second step you need to look at is the type of project you want to fund. So what will it fund? And how do I know the answer is yes to the CRM question? Well, let's have a look at page 1. So if we have a look at page 1, right down the bottom of the page, it says that the digital technology or service must fall within one of 4 different categories. So those categories are, or priorities I think is the word they use, receiving payments and selling online. So if you're making changes to your website to add a shop front or something, that's definitely included. Digital planning, digital marketing strategy development, and digital training is included. Specialised digital technology and or business specific software, and I would say this is where a CRM would actually be caught. And finally, content development. So things like a website, updating web pages, mobile app developments, visual and audio media. Anybody that needs some filming or some Facebook live streaming done, A1 Films. Tim's here recording us today, so you'll be able to get an idea of how awesome it can actually work. It can be funded under this particular grant stream. So they are some examples. Provided you fit within one of those 4 priority areas, you can actually access the Small Business Digital Grant. So now I want you to go to your worksheet. So your worksheet is a separate Word document that I've sent through, and it will have an SRJ flyer at the top. It looks like this. So your worksheet, I want you to think about whether you meet your entity eligibility criteria. It can simply be a yes or a no. So remember page 2 for the business entity criteria. And then page 1, what is your project priority in this? Which one of those 4 areas might it fall in under the potential project you're looking to fund? So I'm going to just give you a minute to actually have a think about that yourselves. And if anybody's got any questions, please feel free to put your comments on Facebook before we continue. Do we have any comments, Nettie?
Yeah, people are going to. Kerry said she's on the right page and she fits all the criteria. So
Awesome. Well done, Kerry.
Yeah.
Now, one very important point I would like to make. Is this grant open, and how do you know if it's open or not? It's a bit of a trick question because the answer is no, it is not open. If you have a look at page 3, it talks about when and how you apply. So once you've worked out that you've met the criteria from both a business and project perspective, you then have to consider how you actually are going to go about doing this application. So how will you apply for this? You actually go to that link, click on it, and it'll take you through to a relevant portal. In this case, they use Smarty Grants. But this particular round of this funding program closed in December last year. Now, the reason I'm still talking about it, and it'll make sense towards the end of the workshop, is that it is one of the few state government grants that is going to be reopened before the end of June. And there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'll talk about at the end. So for those of you who are thinking about a project that might fall within this particular grant funding program, it's a great time to start thinking and planning for that grant success. So as soon as it opens, you've got your ducks in a row and you're ready to go with your application. So whoever said the CRM idea, start thinking about whether you are going to consider applying for this particular grant to help you with that project. Okay, a couple of practical tips. Practical tip number 2, always review the detailed guidelines of whatever grant program you are considering to do before you even go any further. That's always the first step. Print them off, highlight them, flag them, and actually make sure you're aware of all of the different details within there. Practical tip number 3, when you are thinking about, oh, will this be funded? Will that be funded? Would that fit within one of those project priority areas? It obviously doesn't list everything that it will fund. It's up to you and your provider of whatever service or project you're undertaking to map your application and the accompanying quote or proposal to make sure it fits one of the identified priority areas. But a good place to start when you're trying to look for further guidance is every grant guidelines will list in there specific things that will not be funded. So if you go back to the guidelines on this particular grant, it talks about on page 2, you'll see a big heading that says what won't be funded. So it won't fund travel costs. It won't fund fees for related parties. It won't fund franchise fees. It won't fund any maintenance of existing technologies. So if you're just doing a maintenance upgrade or a maintenance repair, I should say, it won't fund that. It has to be an upgrade or something new. It won't fund a website hosting as a standard cost, a standalone cost, but what it will fund is if you are doing a new website, it will fund your first 12 months hosting fees. It won't fund salaries, and it won't fund the cost. No grant program will actually fund the cost of a grant writer to apply it for you, to apply for it on your behalf.
Round 8 is going to open in May during Queensland Small Business Week.
Awesome, thank you for that. So did everybody hear that? Round 8, Nettie's going to make a post on here. So round 8 of the Small Business Digital Grant will actually open in May 2020. Was that from you, Steve? No. Thank you to whoever just made that comment. I appreciate it. Okay, so always make sure that you're aware of what won't be funded when you're considering to put your application together. Okay, next step 3, is make sure you understand the detail in the guidelines to stand out from the crowd. Because if you think about grants, there are thousands and thousands of applications, and the success rate, I hate to say, is relatively low. And grants are competitive beasts. So I've only actually come across one particular grant funding program, which I will speak to you about later, that is non-competitive. So what do I mean by competitive versus non-competitive? So a non-competitive grant is one where if you fit the eligibility criteria, you are entitled to that grant funds. And there's only one particular grant around like that at the moment, which is a federal government grant called the Entrepreneurs Program, which I'll talk about later. Every other grant program is competitive. So what that means is that you don't know how many applications there are. 9 times out of 10, the government doesn't announce what in that particular funding round, what the funding limit is. How do you know how much is available for each particular grant stream? The way I tell is I check the budget for both the state and federal level every year, because that's where they announce different funding priorities, and they might say in that particular budget, for example, like the federal government might say, we're going to make $20 billion available to support manufacturing industry in the form of XYZ grants over the next 3 years. So how much is allocated to the different programs, we actually don't get that published. Trying to find out success rates of grant programs are also not published. However, unofficially, I can tell you that the success rate from my liaising with various government departments rests between 17 to 25%. So it's not high. So how can you make sure that you can put your business in the best position possible to be one of those successful recipients? Make sure your application wording ranks higher than others with some specific key factors, and it's all about the eligibility criteria and what they assess on. So if you take nothing else away from today, I'd like you to remember 2 things. 1, plan for grant success, but 2, if you are going to go down the grant path, every application has to be referred to or brought back to jobs and growth. Grants are political beasts. So grants are there to support governments to achieve their priority areas. So grants are allocated based on how many jobs is this going to generate? How much revenue for Queensland or the federal government is this going to generate? So that's the first thing that you need to think about, jobs and growth. Always make sure you address that. Second thing is make sure that you are familiar with the objectives of each grant program, and more importantly, the assessment criteria. And make sure that you're mapping your projects to those relative objectives. We've got another question. Yeah?
No, it's not a question. It's we gave them a ring, and they say currently they've got more money than they have applications
for
the small business digital grants.
Oh, okay, great. So they're going to
must have some left over. But I guess it's important to say to people that that doesn't mean that sloppy applications or non-relevant applications will be funded. They won't be. But there is still some capacity.
So Nettie just advised that there is still capacity with this particular grant funding. There is still definitely funding left that was unallocated from the last round, which means the next round, round 8, could be your chance for grant success under this particular program. So when you do this grant application, you've identified your business criteria, you've identified your project criteria, you're sure that that's happening. So how do you know what you're going to be assessed on? And again, this is what you map your application to. So what are you going to be assessed on? Well, let's look at page 1 of these detailed guidelines. Page 1 talks about what the core objectives are. So the core objectives are to access latest digital technologies to increase business competitiveness, grow SMEs, employ more Queenslanders, upskill staff and business owners on technologies, allow you to work smarter and be more innovative, and create an environment where it's easier to do business in Queensland. So that's the objectives of this grant, straight from page 1. But is that what you're going to be assessed on? How do we know? The answer is no. How will they be assessed? Let's go to page 3. Right at the bottom of page 3, you will see that says there, how will applications be assessed? So in addition to proving that you meet those relevant eligibility criteria from a business and project perspective, your application must include how that particular piece of digital technology or software is going to improve your business. And that means, and it specifically states this here, what you have to be able to show what is the increase in revenue by doing this project. How much is your revenue going to go up? Is it 100,000 or is it 20%? Is it 10%? And they usually, for this particular grant, require a percentage increase so that you're not disadvantaged based on the size of your business. So what percentage increase in revenue will this project generate for you? What percentage increase in headcount, or how many extra direct and indirect jobs will you create by undertaking this project? What potential employment outcomes, sorry, I just mentioned that one. What time savings can you make? How is this going to make your business more competitive? How will this lead to indirect jobs growth, value for money? So you need to be thinking as you go throughout this, how's this going to grow my business? What's the numbers going to look like? What's the head count going to look like? As well as making sure that you're mapping to the other criteria that we talked earlier about project priority areas. So your practical tip number 4 is make sure that you use a lot of buzzwords that come off page 3 in the application assessment requirements. Make sure that you specifically state how your project will result in each of one of these things being achieved. So how will this increase your headcount? How will this increase indirect jobs for Queensland? How will this increase your revenue? And what percentage revenue increase will it result in for you? So they're the key things that you need to be thinking about when you're putting together this particular grant application. But any grant application, I always want you to think when you're responding to it, jobs and growth. How's it going to grow jobs? How's it going to grow your business? Okay, a couple of other things in terms of detail that's really, really important. Supporting documentation. So what do you need to include in the application? Now, one of the things I will say is this one's actually a relatively easy grant funding program. So this one you need to actually not attach a lot of documentation. What you do need to attach is listed on page 3 of the grant guidelines. So for this particular one, you need to be ensuring that you have a detailed quote. Now, one of the tips that I want to give you is on that detailed quote or supplier or proposal, whatever you want to call it, that they actually also stipulate how that particular project that they've performed will achieve the outcomes as well. It's not enough just to get a quote for website build, okay? Because you need to be making sure that your provider is using the same language that you are in your application. Yep, we've got another comment.
We've got a question. How do we know the predicted percentages? That's from Kerry.
Forecasts. So it comes back to planning. You need to be forecasting. Or for those of you who are smaller, so Kerry, you're probably a sole trader, estimate. So if you do this particular project, will it result in, if your turnover is 50,000 and you think you can generate another $10,000 in fees, then that's a 20% increase. So you need to be thinking about those sort of things. Ideally for my clients, I always do projections and cash flow forecasts as part of their strategic planning to make sure we've got the financial and operational resources to achieve our objectives. For smaller clients that maybe don't have the capacity or the funds to do that, there are grant funding programs available for that. But in this situation, estimate. So I sell 50,000 now. If I put a shop front on my website, I reckon I can sell 60,000. That $10,000 on that 50,000 is a 10% increase. So you think about it and you think about it logically. I will say, one of the things to be mindful of is with your estimates, don't go overboard, but don't underestimate either, because they're not audited. You may be asked though, as part of the acquittal requirements, to prove how you achieved that particular revenue growth in that situation. And if you didn't, why didn't you? So just be mindful of that. So you need quotes from your providers. A lot of the time I would recommend that you actually give whoever's providing the service and doing a proposal to you, actually give them a copy of the detailed guidelines so they know what you're trying to achieve and they know that you're trying to use grant funds to actually do this project. Because 9 times out of 10, they're probably worried that if they don't do a good proposal, or they should be, a good provider should be, that maps your application, that maybe they won't win the job. So the other thing that you need to think about is employee headcount. So how many staff do you have now? Is it 1, 2, 3? How many do you think you will have? Is it 4? So if you're only going to generate one particular job and it's headcount, so that can only be part-time, so 5 hours a week, that's another headcount. If it's not a direct headcount, what you need to be making sure in your application that you are also talking about the flow on jobs, that what I call indirect employment opportunities that your project might create. Yep.
Kerry's asking, when submitting a quote, when the grant is approved, do we need to stay with that provider?
Yes, you must. You cannot, once the grant is approved, the grant will be approved based on the supplier that you submit. You don't get the option to change it later, because part of the due diligence that the government will do behind the scenes is they actually look at the experience and require you to use an experienced provider. So the grant funds, and when you get your acceptance or funding agreement, the funding agreement will list who the nominated provider is, and you don't get the option to actually change that after the fact. So one other thing that you always need to think about is in the proposals, 9 times out of 10 it'll tell you what actually needs to go in there. So this one's not particularly detailed, but a lot of times it requires a breakdown for the larger grant programs of the different activities, who's going to be preparing what activity, what the estimated time frame is in terms of costs and hours, and always a breakdown of eligible and ineligible costs, because when you do a project, particularly if you are putting in like a large piece of equipment, some of those costs are included in grant funding and some of those costs are specifically excluded. So it's important that you actually list that out. They also, for the larger grant programs, now bear in mind this is a really small one. So this grant's a $10,000 grant. So what that means is most of the grant programs that I've come across are co-contribution. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it's usually a 50% co-contribution. So if the government gives you $10,000 to put towards a digital project, you have to provide the other matched funding up to that $10,000 limit. And if you think about it from the government's perspective, it makes sense, because you are more likely to make a success of that project if you're going to put your money where your mouth is and actually contribute some funds of your own. So bear in mind that they will not fund 100% of the project. Usually it's 50-50. The government funds 50, you've got to fund the other 50. So for larger grant programs, you also will require financial statements. For a lot of them, you also require benchmarking, financial projections and cash flows, growth strategies. Depending on the grant program and the fund level that you're applying for, determines the level of documentation required to actually apply. So we're just going through a couple of different grant programs at the moment. One is up to $2.5 million. As you can imagine, the detailed guidelines around that particular program are about 150 pages. And there's a lot of documentation, because if the government's going to invest, close to $1 million or more in your business, they want to make sure that that business is actually viable, and that $1 million of public funds is actually going to be spent appropriately in such a way that it will generate jobs. So you got to put all of that in your application, as well as mapping it to the relevant program objectives and assessment criteria. So if we just looked at this one, what do you need? Page 3, you need a quote. You need a clear outline of how that digital technology or service will enhance your digital capabilities and increase your business competitiveness. You need to be able to explain how it's going to generate revenue growth, cost savings, and employee outcomes. You need to declare your headcount, and you also need to confirm how you are going to make your financial contributions. So the government will always ask you for evidence as to how you are going to contribute your 50%. And 9 times out of 10, that 50% that you contribute has to be a cash contribution. So for instance, if I am going to give you $10,000 under this program, the project value has to be for $20,000. So how are you going to fund your $10,000? You need to be able to explain that. And 9 times out of 10, you cannot say, I will be funding it from my business cash flow. Unless you can prove that, and even for some of the commercialisation grants where it gets a bit trickier because you actually haven't got a product that's got to market yet, those forecasts you need to be thinking about what's a locked-in contract and what's not a locked-in contract and that sort of thing. So usually you try not to go down the I'm going to fund it through my business cash flow. That's not an option. So you need to think, where's the cash going to come from for your cash contribution? Check the devil. So practical tip number 5, check the devil in the detail and make sure your supplier is aware of any detailed quote requirements that needs to go in. And that's where it comes back to giving them a copy of those guidelines. Always check, this is an interesting one. I've had clients ring me after the fact and actually say, it's so-and-so from, Joe Blogg's soccer club. I've just lodged our Gambling Community Benefit Fund application and I forgot to put the proposals and quotes in. Is that going to be an issue? For that particular grant, no. But for some, you need to upload them and you get one chance and one chance only. Make sure that any supporting documentation is uploaded and readable before you click submit. Because heaven forbid, if you went through all of that hard work and got it all done, you click submit, and in the case of the Small Business Digital Grant, you forgot to upload your proposal or your quote. Yep.
Can I also say that I know of some federal grants that were just dismissed completely because of one digit being wrong in the ABN number.
Yep.
They don't have time to go looking for this. They don't contact you, it just goes in the round filing bin.
Absolutely. So I don't know if everyone could hear that, but Nettie just made the point that she's been told by people that, for some of the other grants that she's heard about, that people who have made an error in their ABN number on submission, that's it. If it's not coming up as a valid ABN that actually matches to the relevant criteria for that particular business, you're out straight away. So again, the detail is really, really important because when you're getting thousands of applications, those ones are the easy ones to discard. So be really mindful of the detail. Okay, step 4. Prepare and plan. So this is why I cannot stress enough how important it is to get ready for grants before they actually open. So I mentioned before that it's really tight timeframes. Now this one that we've talked about so far, the Small Business Digital Grant, you probably could pull that together in 28 days. For some of the larger grant programs, there is absolutely no way you could actually do strategic plan, cash flow forecasts, value propositions, benchmarking, getting proposals from multiple providers. There is no way you could pull all that together and continue to run your business at the same time. So you've got to think about it beforehand. So the application processes over the last 8 years have become significantly more onerous, significantly more detailed, and the acquittal requirements that go with that have also become more detailed. So it's really important that you've got as much information together as you can if you're thinking about a grant program. And so I always get asked by people at this stage, well, how do I know what's coming and what's not coming? You get onto mailing lists, as many as you possibly can. So what I will be talking to you about today is some of the common programs that are offered at both state and federal level. A lot of them at state level are currently closed, but some of them will be reopening at certain points, and you need to be aware and ready for if they do reopen. The other thing that I can't stress highly enough is RDA, actually, if you get on their mailing list, they will give you grant updates regularly. And even if you jump on the RDA website, you'll see that there's a whole grant schedule in there. So you just start getting yourself familiar with what's out and how many rounds has it had. So usually most grants, because they're political beasts, run in 3-year cycles. So sometimes that might be, they'll come out once a year for that particular 3-year election cycle, or they might come out twice a year for that particular election cycle. So just start familiarising yourself with some key websites and getting on newsletters. So start with RDA, because I find that's one that summarises really efficiently the various grant programs that are available. Just bear in mind too that the government can move the goalposts. I have been in grant programs before, particularly the multi-stage programs, where the first lot of information that comes out in the guidelines for the expression of interest might be slightly different to what comes out in the detailed application stage. So anything for a larger grant program? We've just got another question. Yep.
Yes, Giant Chaplin's asking or saying that they had an application into round 7 but have not heard whether or not they were successful, and the guidelines say that all applications will be advised of the outcome. Have you heard of applicants not being advised before?
Yes, I have. And the other thing that I've heard is the government, as I said, the government moves guidelines. So quite often they will expect to notify people within 10 to 12 weeks, but government being government, particularly at the moment, that 12 weeks can quite easily blow out to 16 or more weeks before you get notified. You should receive an email from Smarty Grants for this particular grant. Just check your junk folder. If not, the best place to start, on the bottom of these detailed guidelines, you'll see a 1300 number. So ring that. That is the Department of Education, Small Business and Trading, or whatever it's called, DTESB. What's it called now? Yeah. Something like that. So ring the 1300 number and you ask to be put through to the Small Business Digital Grants team. Then explain that you haven't heard and ask them why not, and ask them to resend you the email if the results are actually out. But yes, I hear that quite often. Okay, so in terms of multi-stage application processes, for the larger grant programs, a lot of them will require you to go through an expression of interest phase first, and then if you get through that, the detailed application phase. The detailed application phase, if you get through an EOI, you need to be ready for that detailed application phase, because for those large programs, that the amount of documentation that you actually have to provide is phenomenal, and you will only have 28 days notice or less of whether you're through that first phase. So practical tip, plan. Identify the relevant programs, match your projects as best as possible, and make sure that you've got your ducks in a row before the program actually comes out. Step 5 that I want to say is maximise your funding opportunities. So what do I mean by this? So first thing that you need to do is check all of the supporting activities. So you might find that some things can be funded as part of your project and some things can't. So things like training, if you're putting in digital software under this grant, or if you're putting in production equipment, obviously you're going to need staff training around that. So you need to be making sure that you include any training costs in that particular grant application. Usually installation and implementation costs for particular assets are also included. A lot of the time freight isn't, salaries never are. So just be mindful of what else you could potentially fund. Always utilise the maximum grant amount, because you don't get another bite at the cherry. So if you are successful in a grant program and you choose not to spend the full amount of that grant, you don't get to go back for the difference. And what do I mean by that? So if you get this particular small business digital grant, this is a $10,000 grant. Let's say, because of your project value or whatever, instead of making the project value $20,000, remember, the grant funds can only fund 50%, which is the $10,000. Instead of making your project $20,000, you say, well, I can only afford to make a co-contribution of $5,000. So therefore, I'm only going to do a project of $10,000 and apply for a $5,000 grant. If you are successful, you don't then get to go back and double dip and claim the other $5,000 the next year. It's either you get one bite at the cherry and that's it. Usually most grant programs you can't reapply for 5 years if you are successful. So whoever asked the question before about the last round of this particular grant, if you were unsuccessful, you can actually reapply for this particular grant funding when it reopens. Okay, you can only not reapply if you're successful. The next thing that I want to say is to try and leverage off other grant programs. So in my experience, what I've found, particularly in the federal systems, is if you're in a government funding program, they want that program to be a success. So they are more likely to continue to give you government support to ensure the viability of your business as you progress throughout the project phase. So what do I mean by this? My favourite grant, the only one that's non-competitive, the Federal Government Entrepreneurs Program. How did I come about that program? So about early 2019, I started working with one of my manufacturing clients, and we started with a strategic planning program. So we looked at what the business looks like now, we looked at where it wanted to be, and we did a bit of variance analysis around some of the key financial criteria about what our pain points were. And we came up to the conclusion that one of our product lines was performing really poorly, but it was our highest margin, highest turnover product lines. And the reason it was performing poorly was because the production equipment kept breaking down. We were competing against cheaper Chinese imports, and because we were using gas laser cutters, the cost of electricity and gas had gone through the roof, so our profitability had taken a significant nosedive. So we did a bit of workshopping and we came to the conclusion that, well, to fix this, what we need to do is we need to increase our production and manufacturing capabilities. We need to look at creating bespoke equipment. We need the ability to do 3D design, and we need smart factory integration so that we can check the efficiency in the production line at all stages throughout the manufacturing process. And we came up with a solution that said, well, to do that, what type of equipment do we need? And we came up with a particularly advanced fibre laser cutter. The problem was that fibre laser cutter was based in Germany and it was worth $1.9 million. So then we had to think, well, how can we get this laser cutter? So as part of this program, I had put them through the Entrepreneurs Program. So the Federal Government Entrepreneurs Program, they were in that program. I worked with the nominated federal advisor, and we said one of the key issues affecting this business is profitability and viability, increased competition from China, issues with raising energy costs. We would like to undertake this project, and we actually got that federal government advisor to recommend that in his federal report. So we went from that one particular program, got a program report, had it signed off by the federal government, and then used that as part of our supporting documentation to roll into the Made in Queensland Manufacturing Fund program. Subsequently, we were successful. There was a lot more involved in it than that. It was a massive application, but we got half of that $1.9 million funded. So that was a massive win. And the fact that we had that federal government support because we had rolled from one program to another program, I think increased our likelihood of success. And the other thing is, state government going to give you $900,000. They then provide you other support in the manufacturing space to make sure that that actually is going to happen and that project's successful. So you try and leverage yourself from one program to another. So practical tip number 7, ensure that you've identified all of the relevant supporting activities and potential alternative grant funding programs that can assist you further down the track. Next thing I want to say is understand how the cash flow impact of going for this grant is going to impact your business. So usually grants aren't paid at the beginning of a project. For smaller grant funding programs, such as the Small Business Digital Grant, the way it works is, even though you are required to give a 50% co-contribution, when you are notified you are successful, the government doesn't then deposit $10,000 into your bank account. What happens is you have to work through that project, you have to pay for that project, which in this situation might be up to $20,000, and then you claim the $10,000 back. So realistically, your financial contribution isn't just the 10 that you have to make as your 50% co-contribution, it's really the 20, because you have to fund 20,000 out of your cash flow before you get the other 10 back. And I think that's something that a lot of businesses forget. Okay, so grants aren't all paid upfront on agreement. For the larger programs, they will usually pay you, maybe 25% on signing of the funding agreement or finalisation of the funding agreement. Then they'll pay you different percentage amounts at different stages throughout the project. And then they'll withhold 5% for what we call retention payments. And that 5% you mightn't be able to access until 12 months post-completion of your project. So it's really important that you understand the impact of your cash flow when you're going through grant programs. So most of the time, grant funding programs are 50-50, but sometimes they can actually be as high as 75%. Not many, but some of them are. So most of the time it's 50-50. So you need to think about how you're going to fund your 50%. And you need to think about that and address it before you apply for the grant, because otherwise you could end up in trouble. So a lot of time they will actually require evidence of your contribution, particularly for larger grant programs. So a couple of other things to be mindful of. If you're considering going for larger grant funding programs, such as the Manufacturing Modernisation Fund or the Made in Queensland Fund, where the government is letting you buy assets, in a lot of situations, they won't let you take a charge or a lien against that 50% of component for your co-contribution. So I'll use my client as an example. So $1.9 million of equipment, they had to fund $800,000 themselves, and the government was going to give them $800,000. They didn't have $800,000. They couldn't borrow $800,000 because most banks, for you to be actually able to fund a piece of equipment, most banks will require security against that particular piece of equipment. The funding agreement details under that particular program would not allow a charge to be registered by anybody against the asset that was being part funded by the government. So we came across a bit of a problem. And actually, I heard through the Made in Queensland program in particular that some successful recipients actually had to withdraw from the program even after they were allocated the grant funds because of that situation, because they couldn't manage their own co-contribution. So in our situation, we did some really clever accounting. We had some associated entities and we borrowed through there and on lent the funds, but it was a long process. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to fund your co-contribution. Because a lot of times for equipment purchases, you can't have your contribution funded by a mortgage, an overdraft, a chattel mortgage, or any funding type agreement that requires security over that particular asset. The other thing that you need to think of in terms of the impact on your cash flow is ineligible costs. So a lot of time, particularly for larger programs, you may not have the skill set within your business to actually do a lot of the detailed application. And by that I'm talking about things like cash flows, things like market value propositions, market analysis, that sort of stuff. You might have to engage expert help. That will be at your own cost. So it won't be covered by any of the grant funding programs. So you need to be understanding how you're going to contribute your financial cash contribution. And remember that 9 times out of 10, you pay first and then the government gives you 50% back. unless it's larger. So make sure in practical tip number 8 that you identify and monitor the impact of the project that you're considering undertaking on your cash flow. Okay, so what do I want you to do? I want you to think about whether you're going to apply for the Small Business Digital Grant that will reopen in May. If you are, make sure you fit the entity criteria. Make sure your identified project falls within one of the 4 priority areas. Start thinking about your proposal requirements. Start thinking about your application. Map it to the detailed guidelines. Get an idea of 9 times out of 10 for these particular smaller programs, the funding guidelines don't change significantly. So I would start thinking about this particular program now. Step 7, work with your advisor. So get that plan in place. Identify any relevant grant programs that you might be able to utilise to fund that particular plan or those particular projects. Get expert help for accompanying documentation, particularly for the larger grant programs. And always make sure that you're discussing your situation with your financial advisor, with your bank, with your funding institution, with your accountants, and make sure that everybody's on the same page and working together to achieve your business success. Okay, so that's the first part of the presentation. So the first part of the presentation is about thinking about how you can get ready for your next grant application to ensure you're best placed for success. Now let's look at what happens when you get it. So everybody will any successful applicant will receive a funding agreement. It's really important that you read the detail of that funding agreement. For larger agreements, I always suggest that you have your solicitor look over that particular agreement. But in particular, you want to be looking for things like, is there any variations in that to what was in the actual guidelines? Because the government has the right to change the program at any particular time. But also check what happens if you make any variations to the program. So if you don't achieve what you said you were going to achieve, what's the consequence of that? Check confidentiality clauses. So I can't tell you the name or of the client that we accessed $900,000 for because there's a confidentiality clause in that particular funding agreement. And without written express permission issued that I asked for 28 days in advance, I'm not allowed to mention it. So confidentiality clauses actually exist, which I think is ridiculous, but they do. No, the reason being is the government likes to control the message. So there you go. So I can't tell you who got it. Next one is check your payment schedules. So your funding agreement stipulates when you can expect to receive the grant funds. For smaller programs such as the Small Business Digital Grant, it'll be after the project is completed. Once you have lodged your acquittal documentation, then you will receive the funds within either 14 or 28 days, depending on the program. For larger programs, it's staged throughout the project life cycle, which vary between 12 months to 24 months. I've got another question.
Yeah, I've got a couple. I think one's probably best left till the end, so
Yep.
we'll come back to that. But I've got one from Kerry right now. She's talking, remember she asked the question earlier about the quote, and if you
Yep.
need to stay with that provider. Now I think, I've asked her, but I haven't heard back. I think what she's saying is, she said is, when talking about the provider previously, and staying with the one that gives you the quote, is there a list that we see that we then choose from?
No, Kerry, it's up to you to find your preferred provider. So depending on the service, you have to find who, can you hear me? Oh, sorry.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, is there a list of preferred providers for various grant programs? No, because that would be unfair for the government to say you can only use X, Y, and Z. So it's usually up to the grant applicant to identify who they would like to actually undertake that particular project or service. I hope that answers your question, Kerry. So check your funding requirement, check your payment schedule, and check your acquittal requirements. So when you get your funding agreement, as I said earlier, it will list who the service providers are to be, and they will be the people that you actually provided the proposals for. Acquittal. So what happens on acquittal? So you've got the grant, you've signed your funding agreement, you've done your project. Before the government will release any funds, you must go through an acquittal process. And even if it's a larger program, at each, such as the Made in Queensland, the $900,000 grant that we got, at each stage before the government would release any funds, we had to do an acquittal report for that particular stage. So in this situation that we're looking at today for the Small Business Digital Grant, once you've done your project, it'll have a date that it needs to be acquitted by. So at the moment, I'm working with clients on the Small Business Entrepreneurs grant. So that particular grant was a $5,000 grant, so it's a $10,000 project. Those projects have to, under the terms of the funding agreement that they received, the project must be completed by the 12th of April and acquittal must be lodged by the 12th of May. So it's really important on that funding agreement that you understand what your acquittal requirements are and when it has to be done by. Because if you don't acquit correctly, you're at risk of two things. Certainly, the biggest risk is you will never receive money from that particular government again. And secondly, there is a chance that you will get a big please explain and actually have to submit some of the money back. So acquittal is really, really important. So tax invoices. I know we've got quite a few not-for-profits online at the moment. A lot of my not-for-profits have been successful in the Gambling Community Benefit Fund. I can't state highly enough how important it is when you submit your invoices that you have paid under that particular grant, that the amounts tie up to what you actually had in your original application. So check that your invoices are correctly mapped to that original application. Minimise the documents to be uploaded. So if you've got 4 or 5 different invoices, and I'll give you an example of this, again, not for profit. So I helped a sporting club in the local area apply for some gym equipment. So we wanted to set up a gym. We're going to earn another income stream for the club because they could charge their members to come and use that gym. They could also open up to other sporting organisations. So you can imagine if you're setting up a gym, there's lots and lots of pieces of equipment. So rather than upload 30 invoices separately, which is going to take ages, we actually put a spreadsheet together, attached the invoices behind it, consolidated it together into one summary with all the invoices attached, had one PDF, and we uploaded that one PDF only. And we made sure that the total mapped to the original application. So as I said, larger grant programs, you'll have to do progress reports, usually at the 6 months, 12 months and completion stage. And then for the final 5% retention payment, it's usually 12 months post-completion. For some programs, you will actually have to submit independent audit reports, but they tend to be for the large grant programs, not the smaller ones we've talked about today. Okay, that's acquittal. The last thing I want to talk about is what type of grants might actually be available to the different people that we've got online today. And I'm just going to start with a few of my favourites. So the first thing that we need to be aware of is that every level of government has different types of grants. So we have local government grants, which for most of the people that are online today will be the Moreton Bay Regional Council grants. Or some of us, if you're down that sort of Brendale, Strathpine area, you flow over into the Brisbane City Council. So either Moreton Bay or Brisbane City Council grants will have grants funding. Local government grants tend to be for not-for-profits. So it's to support local community type events and programs. Yeah, we've got another question.
Well, it's more a comment. Tamara's come through asking about sort of for not-for-profits, and she's mentioned our own energy. So I suppose it's worth talking about philanthropic money as well. But the same principles apply. There's usually an objective and people need to match and meet that criteria. I'm going to have a look at this stuff and get back to Tamara.
So Tamara, you're absolutely right. There are every one of the major, I shouldn't say that, A lot of the larger organisations within Australia have foundations that allocate grants. So things like Coles, Woolworths, all of the banks, Bendigo Bank, Arrow Energy, there's thousands of them. All of those have also got grant funding programs for not-for-profits. Given, as I said at the beginning, I don't have time to talk about the thousands of different grants that are available or ones for specific individuals, but the principles behind each of the different grants, whether it's an Arrow Energy, whether it's a Commonwealth Bank grant, whether it's a Bendigo Bank grant, and Bendigo, I must say, and also CUA have been particularly brilliant for not-for-profits in this area. I've got quite a few of my clients not-for-profits who have managed to get grant funding from those particular income streams. So by all means, if you are a not-for-profit, you need to be getting on to those larger organisations and having a look at their different funding programs. But in terms of preparing and mapping it to the criteria, the principles are exactly what we talked about today. So thank you. I'll make sure that I actually add that to my slides for next time. So we've got the Moreton Bay Regional Council or Brisbane City Council grants. Then we have state government grants. And then on top of that, we also have federal government grants. Within that, you have different governing bodies, I should say, or different government departments that also operate and administer the different grant programs. So as I said, there are literally thousands of these. These are some of the ones that we use regularly for both business and not-for-profit clients. So the first program I want to tell you about is the federal government's Entrepreneurs Program. This program is brilliant. I use the business management arm of this program for a lot of my clients. And the reason I love it so much is it is one of the few particular programs that is non-competitive. So under the business management arm of this, there sits a $20,000 business growth grant. And if you meet the relevant criteria, you can actually access that. So I've got probably 29 different clients at various stages throughout that program. The whole purpose of this program is the government is trying to support the SME market and actually embed capacity and capability, growth and profitability within businesses in their 4 identified at-risk industries, or what I should say, growth industries in particular. So areas the government wants to focus as part of their policy because they believe those industries have the best jobs potential. And I'll tell you those in a minute. So that's one arm. So number 2 on the PowerPoint, business management, fantastic program. Accelerating commercialisation grant. Done a few of those. Currently trying to wait to see if we've got our current one successful. It is a dog's breakfast of a grant, if I'm allowed to say that. It is a nightmare grant to actually apply for. But if you think about grants in the commercialisation space, they're high risk from a government perspective. And they're high risk because the business has no proven track record, because it hasn't actually had the product or service out on the market to actually have a track record of sales for it. So the whole point about it is the government will help select businesses commercialise particular products and services that they think have really good potential for revenue and jobs growth for Australian economy. To access it is quite difficult, and it's quite an onerous task, but it's out there. Incubator support is also another good one for those in the innovation space, because it can actually fund an expert in residence to actually come and support you to develop your designs and things. So it is a good part. Innovation Connections tends to be for unis and research type institutions. So I actually haven't had a lot of involvement on number 4 previously. What I have had a lot to do with is the business growth grant under this particular program. So this is the $20,000 non-competitive 50-50 matched funding program. To access this program, you need to have 3 things. So you need to have been operating for 3 years or more. You need to have your turnover over $1.5 million. Actually, you need 4 things. you have to have a company within your company, within your business structure. So that means they really like you to be a company set up. However, if you are a trust, as a lot of my clients are, and you have a corporate trustee, we can still get you into this particular program. And you have to be operating in one of these identified government priority growth areas. So that is manufacturing. They call it advanced manufacturing, but it's manufacturing. Food and agribusiness, meditech and pharmaceutical, mining, equipment, technology and services, oil, gas and energy, and tourism businesses in, it says Northern Australia, but it's really Northern Territory and the very tip of far north Queensland. So most of my clients fall outside of that, so in the tourism space, unfortunately. Okay, so if you are in one of those and you fit those categories, please make contact with me because I'd love to put you through this particular program. And it is fully funded till the end of 2021, so it is open and still funding available. The federal government also has a lot of funds around manufacturing, as does the Queensland one. This is a really good program to fund new technologies, new production equipments. It's not as strenuous an application as the state-based application because it's less money. It's currently closed, although rumour has it that it is looking to be reopened in June 2020. So if you're a manufacturer considering upgrading some equipment or introducing some new technology, have a think about that particular grant program. Queensland state government funding. Now, I have to preface this by saying that right at the beginning, I said that grants were political beasts. It's all about jobs and growth. What are we in? We're in a political cycle. So this is election year. This is also the year that Queensland has been hammered. We have had bushfires, we have had cyclones, we now have the coronavirus. So if you think from the government's perspective, the government only has a certain pot of money. It didn't automatically, just because we were hit with bushfires, find a whole heap of extra money. So what it tends to do in crisis times is it tends to divert funding from one program and give to another with a higher need. And that's what we've seen in the Queensland state government grant space. Particularly given, as I said, it's an election year. What I would suggest if you're thinking about going for any of the Queensland state grants, I believe the government is actually bringing down the state budget a little bit earlier this year, which might be sort of April time. So keep an eye out for that state budget. The government makes announcements in state budgets of what they will actually fund, and following the announcements, then they'll talk about the relevant grant funding programs. Bear in mind, if we end up with a change of government, that all changes again. So it's a real flux year this year. So because of that, a lot of the state government's funding programs are closed. So small business entrepreneurs grant, I've had a lot of success with. It's brilliant for startups, it's brilliant for small businesses, sole traders, because it will fund all of those things that I've talked about as being really important. It'll fund strategic plans, it'll fund cash flows, it'll fund marketing plans, it'll fund pretty much anything you need that's not nuts and bolts and not digital technology, because that's covered elsewhere. To actually help get your business up and running. It is a fantastic program. It closed in December last year. I'm currently working through the current round with clients as we speak. At this stage, it is not scheduled to reopen because we're in that flux election cycle year. Small Business Digital Grant is expected to reopen. We believe that it will be reopened in the May Small Business Week, which I think is around middle of May. Off the top of my head, I think it's about the 19th of May, thereabouts. So keep an eye out for that one. This is the particular grant guidelines that we've been going through today. Business Growth Fund, again, currently closed. They just had their last panel sitting in February, but it is a great grant funding program. If you don't even have to be a manufacturer, but if you are a business that needs a particular piece of equipment or technology to take advantage of an identified grant or growth opportunity. So to access that one, a couple of requirements. You have to have been trading for more than 3 years. You have to have less than 50 employees, and you have to have turnover of more than 500,000. But it is a great program. Made in Queensland, which I've spoken about a lot, is a state-based funding program specific for manufacturers. It has just closed. At this stage, there is no confirmed reopening date, so it's a case of, again, watch the space, watch what happens at the budget announcement, watch what happens with the election. A couple of other Queensland government fundings. If you're in the commercialisation space, so if you're a startup or somebody with an idea, Ignite Ideas is a fantastic funding program. Difficult to get, as Steve can attest. A lot of requirements to actually get it, but well worth it if you actually can. And even through going through, one of the other things that I'd like to say, I know I've talked about how hard it is to get grants, particularly the larger grant funding programs, but just by going through the process, you learn so much about your business, and you focus on your business and by preparing a lot of the documentation, regardless of whether you're successful enough, you're actually setting yourself up in the process for business success. So I don't believe, whether you're successful or not, that it's ever a waste of time to actually go through this sort of process, particularly for programs such as the Business Growth Fund, such as the Ignite Ideas, because you actually get feedback for these types of programs, not all of them, but you actually get feedback on your business. And feedback from panels of experts who actually say, that's not a good idea, but if you tweaked X, Y, and Z, it would be a great idea. Why don't we do this? And I'm also a nominated Queensland Business Mentor under the Department of Education, Small Business and Training. And those panels are really informative and useful for business advisors. So you get so much free advice just by going through the process, regardless of whether you actually are successful with the grant funds or not. Highly recommend it. Ignite Ideas, difficult to get, but a fantastic process and a great learning way or learning pathway for those of you in that commercialisation space. So 2 tiers. Tier 1 is a grant funding up to $100,000, but you must actually make a 20% co-contribution. Tier 2, up to $200,000, and you need to make up to a 50% co-contribution. To access this, you have to be past the research and development phase. So you actually have to be at minimum viable product phase before you can actually go to apply. It is 2-stage application process. The expression of interest is due to reopen in April 2020. So if you are in that space, make sure that you're having a think and starting to have a look about that Ignite Ideas program. Other tip for commercialisation space is the Business Development Fund. Now, I've looked at this for different clients and I've never used it. And the reason I choose not to use it is because you actually have to give away equity in your idea to actually access this particular pathway. So you actually have to find a co-investor first before you can even apply. And they have to make a 50% equity contribution or 50% contribution in return for equity. There are buyback options down the track. However, I have heard unofficially, and Steve, you might be able to comment more on this in your space, that particularly if you use a university, that a lot of the time they will not allow you to buy back that 50% co-contribution, and they will own a lot of the IP around that particular idea. So because of that, I actually prefer the Accelerating Commercialisation program under the Entrepreneurs program if you're in that commercialisation space. Okay, let's talk about some other fantastic Queensland initiatives that are still open. So anybody that runs a business, not-for-profit, anybody, there is a fantastic free program called the Injury Prevention and Management Program. It's run by Work Australia or Work Queensland. I don't want to say Work Cover because people think that they'll get dobbed in. It is linked to Work Cover, but it's a fantastic free program. So I've put a lot of clients through this, and there's 3 different tiers depending on the complexity of your business and depending on where you are in your life cycle. So what it is you request a free evaluation of your business, you get a nominated advisor come out, and they'll look at all your WH&S policies, and they'll give you recommendations for improvement, and they'll even work with you to implement different things. They'll even give you templates for your policies, so it can save you thousands in some situations. It is a brilliant program. At first, when I started talking to clients about it, the feedback that I got was, well, why would I want to do that? Because if they're work cover, they're going to dob me in if they find something. I can assure you that that is not the case. And it's not the case because they actually want you to go through this program. The only time there is mandatory reporting is if they come across a situation where they believe employees or visitors are at risk of serious injury or death, and you don't do anything to rectify it. That is the only time there is mandatory reporting. The rest of the time, there is no reporting. Okay, so they just work with you. Fantastic program. Again, if you are interested in that program, please contact Nettie through the contact email that she's listed, and she'll forward it on to me and I can assist you. The other thing that I want to bring up is Back to Work in Southeast Queensland. It's a fantastic program. There are only certain regions within Queensland that can actually access this program, and Moreton Bay is lucky enough to be one of those. And it's all about increasing employment in our region. So it will give you, if you're in a business and you're thinking about putting on staff, it'll give you employer support payments. If you put somebody on that's between 15 to 24 and they only have to have been unemployed for 4 weeks, you can actually get up to $20,000 in the Youth Boost payments. Now it's a staggered payment that's made over the first 12 months of that particular staff member being with you and staying with you for that 12-month period. But if you think about it, if you're putting somebody on in that age bracket, their salary is not going to be significantly higher than that anyway, in which case you're probably likely to get a large chunk of that salary refunded to you. The other one that I want to point out is the employer support payments. Now these are slightly lower, they're up to $15,000, but to be eligible for this particular one, you have to take on somebody that was previously unemployed for greater than 52 weeks. So it's a bit more stringent, that one. And the reason it's been designed this way is Moreton Bay and some of the other areas that have been selected, such as Logan, for example, we have really high youth unemployment in our areas, and this program has been brought out to address that. So again, fantastic free program for Moreton Bay employers. Okay, I just want to briefly now, I'm just conscious of time, talk about some of the not-for-profit grants that are actually available. So Moreton Bay Regional Council programs. So these are currently closed. Again, election. But I generally don't expect them to change significantly as a result of the election. But just keep an eye out. They will be reopening around July 2020. There might be some slight tweaks to the community programs, but I don't expect them to be significant. So these will fund things like community activities if you're putting on an event within Moreton Bay, community organisation development grants. So I've used that for not-for-profits to run strategic planning sessions, to do things like skills development with staff and that sort of stuff. And these aren't 50-50 co-contributions, by the way. You don't have to make any contribution for these. You can just claim up to $15,000. Community facilities, though, it is a grant to upgrade facilities within not-for-profits in the area. That does require a co-contribution. It's only about 25% though. So make sure that you have a look at the Moreton Bay Regional Council website, that you register for any updates in terms of funding programs, and that you've got your eye on the ball for when they're re-released in beginning of July. Same situation occurs in the Brisbane City Council region. Again, I don't have any potential release dates for these. They're closed pending election. I don't expect them to significantly change. There is one still open, which is the Lord Mayor's Community Fund, which is a funding program up to $10,000. It's still open at the moment and potentially will remain open until June or until the full funding is actually extinguished. So if you are a not-for-profit and you're located in the Brisbane City Council, jump on the website and make sure you have a look at that. Another really good one for the Gambling Community Benefit Fund is for not-for-profits is the Gambling Community Benefit Fund. So there's 5 different priority areas. Again, it is due to reopen, or it is actually open. I think if it hasn't opened today, it'll be opening in the next couple of days, and it's open until the 30th of April. So I would suggest anybody that's listening that is a not-for-profit that they jump on that website and have a look at that particular grant to see if it's something that they might wish to consider. Export space. So just quickly, I want to have a brief chat about the export space. There's 2 different funding programs that are available for businesses that are considering exporting or who already are exporting. Trade Investment Queensland, or TIQ, has just released a Go Global export program. It is a state program designed to encourage businesses to get export ready. It has 2 levels of grants, micro and macro grants, and it's currently open till the end of May. So again, if you are considering exporting, please contact TIQ and have a look at that particular grant funding program because you've still got time. This is one you claim after you already are an exporter, and it's actually it's not really a grant, it's actually a piece of legislation, and it's similar to the Research and Development Tax Incentive, if anybody out there has ever been through that program. If you spend over $15,000 in a grant year, which is a financial year, you can actually access up to a 50% cash rebate, less the first $5,000 of eligible expenditure, for eligible export expenditure. So I've got a lot of clients through this various program. It's a fantastic program. The lodgement requirements are pretty onerous though, because it is legislation that you actually have to comply with. Sorry, all this talking. It's weird not having anyone here to ask questions. Okay, so because of this, it is a more complex program, but you can apply for up to 8 years. And in your first year of exporting, you're better off to actually combine your first 2 years, so maybe wait a year, and to get you over that threshold, and then you can get a bigger refund for that particular year. But again, depending on costs and depending on cash flow, it's something you need to be talking to your advisors about. So it opens every year on the 1st of July and closes at the end of November. And it's really important with this one because it is legislation based, because it has heavy audit activity, that you've got your documentation sorted. So if you are thinking about going down the export route, you really need to be talking to somebody now about the documentation requirements to access these grants. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to take a moment to talk about all of the press that you've been reading about and hearing about in terms of the federal and state government coronavirus stimulus package that's recently been announced. When Scott Morrison first announced the federal government package, we were inundated with calls from clients, non-clients, talking about what's this $25,000 grant? Because he referred to cash grants for businesses up to $25,000. I just want to make it really clear, there is no cash grant up to $25,000. It was terminology that I don't think was very well used. There is a pay-as-you-go cash flow tax credit that is available on lodgement of your business activity statements starting from March, which I'll talk about in a minute, up to $25,000, but it is not a cash grant. What has been announced is, from a federal government perspective, they're talking about increasing the instant asset write-off from $30,000 where it is now up to $150,000, and increasing the accelerated depreciation deductions up to 50% for those assets that are over that. You must have purchased and installed the assets between 12th of March, when the announcement was made, and 30th of June 2020 to actually access either of these concessions. A lot of clients have said to me, well, that's a waste, because the last thing I'm going to do is go and spend $150,000 on an asset in this particular time. That is a consideration. However, if you are planning on doing it, just be mindful that there are some good incentives available to actually do it. This is the one that caused the most confusion, but is also the most beneficial to the majority of small to medium-sized enterprises. So if you are an SME with turnover, I think it's less than 50 million, you can receive a credit for up to 50% of your pay-as-you-go withholding requirements that is automatically triggered on lodgement of your March BAS. So what that means is if you are paying wages between 1st of January 2020 and 30th of June 2020 on your March BAS, you will only have to pay, or you'll be allocated a credit for 50% of your pay-as-you-go withholding entitlement. So if you are monthly, it'll be 50% for March, April, May and June, or until such particular time as you've hit the $25,000 threshold. If you are quarterly, so that your cash flow isn't, or so that you get the same benefit as monthly lodgers, they're actually giving you an accelerated 150% credit in that first March lodgement. So please make sure that you talk to your tax advisor in relation to how that specifically will impact you. That's also available for employers that maybe employ staff, however don't have a pay-as-you-go withholding requirement because those particular staff members might be below the tax-free threshold. In that situation, you can still access up to a $2,000 credit. So please make sure that you're talking to your tax advisors about how that will actually impact you, or alternatively, give me a call. Wage subsidies paid to apprentices. So if you have a registered apprentice or trainee as at the 1st of March 2020, the federal government is offering a 50% wage subsidy for wages paid between January 2020 and September 2020, up to $21,000. So it'll be payable in $7,000 per quarter, $7,000 in March, $7,000 in June, $7,000 in September. To actually keep those employees on board. There is also a lot of press around the stimulus payments to individuals, so the $750 that you've all heard about. You will only be receiving those if you are already a benefit recipient. So if you are a pensioner, a social security recipient, a veteran, if you're registered for family tax benefit and receiving payments, if you are income support recipients or eligible concession card holders, you'll automatically receive those in your payments, and they're expecting that that $750 will be paid by mid-April at the latest. For businesses, there is ATO support that is available in terms of deferred payment plans for tax obligations, including a complete deferral on payroll tax until the 3rd of August 2020. There's also interest and penalty remittance support, instalment variation support. There's a lot of information and support that's available from the ATO, and everybody that registered today has a summary that I've given you on all of these different stimulus provisions in your packs that was emailed to you. From a state-based perspective today, in the last couple of days we've heard an announcement about no interest or 12-month interest-free loan up to $250,000. As yet, there's been no detail released around that. All I can say is that it has been announced as a low-interest facility to keep employers employing Queensland-based staff with the first 12 months interest-free. Now, all of the stimulus packages, the way law's made in Australia, legislation has to be tabled to Parliament and agreed, signed off on or ratified, whatever it's called, what the technical term is. But none of that legislation has actually been presented yet. So all we have to go on is the government announcements. So I don't have a lot more detail than what's actually in your summary packs that you've been given today in terms of those stimulus packages. Okay, so how do we wrap this up today? So after today, I want you to remember when you're thinking about applying for grants, I want you to think about the 7-step process that we've actually been through. Start planning for that business success. Get your strategic plan in order for your business's benefit and also to make sure that you can provide it as part of the support for your grant application and notify why you're going for that particular funding program. Follow my 8-point practical checklist, or talk to us. Talk to Nettie, talk to myself. Make sure that you are familiar with all of the 8 tips that we've discussed today. So that's it from me, unless anybody has any final questions. Thank you to RDA, thank you to A1 Films. Nettie, do we have any final questions before we wrap up?
Nothing had come through. I'll just go back to the phone in a minute and see. I just want to let everybody know that you can have a look at a whole list of those grants that Di was talking about on the RDA website. They're all there under the grants tab, including the not-for-profit ones. We update those all the time, and I think you referred to the fact that if people subscribe, you can get a fortnightly update. So in fact, the advice is always go onto the page, have a really good look, digest it, go in, dig down into those things. Don't just sort of look at them, click on them, have a look at the criteria. Then once you've understood everything that's there, you only have to keep up to date with what comes through every fortnight. It makes your job a lot easier. I'd like to thank Di very much for today. I'll just go and check the questions before we sign off. I'd love to thank Tim Pasqualone from A1 Productions. Our very first webcast seemed to go quite well. Thank you, Tim. We'll be doing more of this. And Steve was throwing his 2 bobs worth in all through as well, so thank you. I'll just go and check if there's any questions.
There's no other questions, just everyone thanking for such a great session.
Thank you. Well, that's it. Live Facebook feed, so stay tuned to the RDA. We'll be running more of these sessions, and I wish you all the best luck for your grant success. Bye.